The dawn of civilization did not rise with freedom, but with laws carved into stone and enforced through fear. In the bustling heart of Babylon nearly 4,000 years ago, the people gathered before a towering black monument, the Code of Hammurabi. Etched into its surface in neat cuneiform were rules that promised order, but order came with a price. These laws did not speak of forgiveness, they spoke of retribution, of justice that mirrored pain with pain. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, the stone proclaimed. And so it was, a thief who stole grain or silver could have his hands cut off, a dishonest merchant caught cheating might be drowned in the river. Even builders lived under fear, for if a poorly built house collapsed and killed its owner, the builder himself would be put to death. In Babylon, the law was a mirror, reflecting your crime back upon you, and every punishment was written to strike terror into all who might be tempted to stray. But Babylon was not unique in this. Across the great river valleys of Mesopotamia, laws existed not to protect the weak, but to preserve power. Women accused of adultery could be cast into the Euphrates, their lives left to the mercy of the current. Children who struck their fathers could have their hands cut off, ensuring no one forgot the sacred order of family. Slaves who defied their masters were branded, their flesh scarred as a permanent mark of obedience. Justice was not a balancing scale, it was a hammer, wielded by kings who believed their right to rule had been given by the gods. Every punishment, no matter how cruel, was justified as divine will. Move east, and the Qin dynasty of ancient China carried the same cold logic into its empire. For the first emperor, laws were not guides but weapons. Crimes as small as speaking against authority or failing to pay taxes could bring branding, amputation, or death. Families of rebels were slaughtered together, a punishment designed to erase not just an enemy but his entire bloodline. Those condemned to hard labor were forced to wear heavy wooden collars called kangs, massive frames that made eating, drinking, or lying down nearly impossible. They stumbled through villages like walking warnings, their shame and pain as visible as the words carved into the collars themselves. For greater crimes, the punishments grew darker still. Ling Chi, the death by 1,000 cuts, was the empire's most feared penalty. Bound to a wooden frame, the condemned was carved piece by piece, his flesh falling in ribbons while the crowd looked on. To the emperor, this was not cruelty, it was order, a spectacle to remind every subject that obedience was the only path to survival. And yet, even within these brutal codes, people endured. They whispered cautionary tales, teaching children to obey not because they understood justice, but because they feared what came when justice was broken. Across Babylon and China, law was not a shield but a sword, and its edge was always sharpened against those too weak to resist it. The Nile flowed like a lifeline through Egypt, but along its banks the pharaoh's word was law, and his punishments were carved with the same permanence as hieroglyphs on stone. To break the law in Egypt was to insult not only the king but the gods themselves, for the pharaoh was considered divine. Grave robbers, who dared to steal from the tombs of kings, met fates so terrifying that even whispers of their punishment silenced villages. Some were buried alive beneath the very sands they disturbed, the sun baking their bodies until the desert claimed them. Others were flayed, their skin stripped away in public squares, their hides displayed like grim banners of obedience. And for the greediest, there was the cruelest irony of all, molten gold poured down their throats, turning their lust for treasure into the fire that consumed them. Each act was more than punishment, it was a ritual, a performance to remind every Egyptian that order, or ma'at, was fragile and must be preserved through fear. In the golden age of Greece, where marble temples gleamed and philosophers debated virtue, law carried its own shocking edge. The city-states that celebrated democracy and reason also enforced harsh penalties on those who stepped outside their boundaries. Slaves who attempted escape could be branded with hot irons, their flesh permanently marked as property. Thieves might be mutilated, their noses or ears cut away so that every passerby knew their shame. For traitors, the punishment was exile or death, sometimes carried out by hurling them from cliffs into the sea. And then there was the fate of Socrates, condemned by Athens itself. His crime was not theft or violence but questions about the gods, about justice, about truth. Forced to drink a cup of hemlock, his students wept as he calmly accepted his sentence. His death was quiet, but it carried the weight of a society willing to silence its greatest thinker in the name of law. It was proof that even in a land that claimed to love wisdom, law could become a blade turned against the very minds that shaped it. Beyond Greece, in Sparta, the harshest punishments were not even always reserved for criminals, but for those who showed weakness. Spartan boys who failed their brutal military training were beaten, humiliated, and sometimes left to die, their failure considered a crime against the state. Law here was not written on scrolls but etched into the flesh of children, binding them to the iron discipline that kept Sparta feared across the Greek world. But perhaps no civilization mastered the marriage of law and punishment as completely as Rome. Their laws were vast, detailed, and admired for centuries, but beneath their order lay punishments meant to burn terror into the heart of every citizen and slave. Crucifixion was Rome's signature punishment, a spectacle of suffering reserved for rebels, slaves, and the lowliest of criminals. Bodies nailed to wooden crosses lined the roads, turning the empire's highways into corridors of death. Lesser crimes brought scourging with whips tipped in bone and metal, each lash tearing open skin until blood soaked the stones. Treachery, however, often carried the most spectacular ends, nobles stripped of rank and executed in the arena, their deaths entertainment for tens of thousands. Lions tore men apart as crowds roared, law transforming into theater beneath the Roman sun. For Rome, law was not only structure, it was power, displayed through agony, written in blood, remembered in silence. Across Egypt, Greece, and Rome, laws claimed to preserve order, but they did so by turning punishment into spectacle. They stitched obedience into the soul of their people not with justice, but with fear. To live in these worlds was to walk a narrow path, one wrong step leading not to forgiveness, but to the stage where your suffering became a lesson for all. As the ancient world gave way to the medieval age, laws grew even harsher, their punishments transformed into public performances that bound entire societies in fear. Justice was no longer hidden in courts or palaces, it was carried out in marketplaces, on scaffolds, and in the shadow of cathedrals, where thousands gathered to witness the fate of the condemned. In Europe, kings and churches wielded law as a weapon not only against criminals but against anyone who dared question their authority. Heresy, witchcraft, and treason became crimes punished with fire. Wooden stakes rose in crowded squares, dry logs stacked high as priests read charges aloud. When the torches were lit, flames devoured flesh as the crowd watched, torn between fascination and horror. To burn at the stake was not just death, it was a warning that to stray from faith or loyalty meant being consumed in public, your screams rising with the smoke into heaven. The Inquisition turned punishment into ritualized terror. Those accused of doubting the Church's power were dragged into chambers of stone, where devices like the rack stretched their bodies until joints tore apart, or iron boots crushed bones to splinters. Water torture filled lungs again and again, victims choking and gasping while their judges demanded confessions. Few ever escaped without scars, and fewer still lived to tell their stories. Yet every punishment was carefully staged, designed not only to break one person but to remind entire communities of the price of disobedience. Outside the dungeons, the breaking will became one of the most feared executions in Europe. Prisoners were bound to a massive wooden wheel as executioners smashed their bones with iron bars, twisting their bodies into grotesque shapes. Sometimes they were left alive, woven into the spokes of the wheel and raised high for all to see, a living scarecrow of suffering. Death could take hours, even days, while birds circled above, feasting on flesh. The law demanded not just death but degradation, ensuring the condemned would be remembered only through pain. Even punishments that seemed simple, like beheading or hanging, were turned into drawn-out spectacles. A poorly aimed axe could strike again and again before the head finally fell, while hangings often dragged on as bodies convulsed for minutes before stillness came. These were not accidents but reminders, the condemned were meant to suffer, their agony a lesson no law book could teach as effectively as blood on the ground. Yet, as centuries passed, voices began to rise against this cruelty. Philosophers and reformers questioned whether justice could truly be found in fire and steel. Was law meant to guide society, or merely to terrify it into silence? The Enlightenment sparked debates that spread across Europe, slowly peeling away the layers of brutality. Executions retreated from marketplaces into more private arenas, and punishments once seen as righteous came to be remembered with shame. Looking back now, the laws and punishments of Babylon, China, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and medieval Europe shock us not only for their cruelty but for what they reveal. Justice in the ancient world was never about balance, it was about control. Each lash, each flame, each broken bone was a stone laid in the foundation of empires. But their echoes still speak to us today, warning that law without mercy becomes tyranny, and that true justice cannot be built on suffering alone. The past reminds us that civilizations endured not because of cruelty, but in spite of it, and that the greatest law of all is the one that learns from history's darkest lessons.